Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special price gouging edition of the Slingshot. And because this issue is so big and so controversial, we needed to have two special guests on our show just to break it down for us. One guest is Gyauch-Lewis. She runs the Revolving Door Project's economic media project, which was launched in summer of 22, and it highlights how neoliberal pundits are being quoted unscrupulously in the press. You're doing God's work. Thanks for coming on, Dylan.
Yeah. Hi, Hal. Happy to be here.
And our other guest is Luke Goldstein. Luke is a writing fellow at the American Prospect, where he covers economic issues. And in case you missed it, I commend you to go read an amazing piece that he wrote in June titled "Three Algorithms in a Room" on how companies are using software to fix prices. Imagine that. Luke, I didn't think that was possible in our economy. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the plug for the magazine piece.
Sure thing. And let's also say hi to my partner in crime, Darren Bush, who teaches at the law school at the University of Houston. And he's here to keep everything that we say legal and in the bounds. Darren, how's everything?
Pretty good. I mean, if you guys want to start some price fixing, apparently it's in vogue nowadays.
Okay. Today we're going to discuss three very hot topics. The first is going to be the economics and media freakout, meltdown, over the Harris economic policy rollout and the price gouging proposal in particular. We're also going to discuss the RealPage lawsuit, and we'll wrap up, time permitting, with the Kroger Albertson's merger trial. Let's start with the economic and media freakout. I'll put it to you, Luke, first. What did the naysayers say about Harris's price gouging plans, and how did they get it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of hard to know where exactly to begin with all this. But I suppose first to kind of diagnose what this whole meltdown freak out is really about by a lot of people in the kind of neoclassical economics world and some people in the media. So Harris puts out this whole proposal earlier this month, and it includes a lot of different stuff, but there's this one key plank where she's more or less endorsing some kind of federal ban on price gouging, specifically for groceries, kind of basic goods. There's some other stuff in there that we can get into, but I think the kind of background context here is that for the past 4 years, really, there's been this pretty vociferous debate about what the causes of inflation are, rising costs and such. And the whole premise of her proposal and endorsement that, companies might actually, be somewhat to blame here, is kind of, endorsing this kind of school of thought that goes by, different terms. Greedflation's one of them, choke pointflation. Really kind of starts back with, in some ways, this piece that an economics professor at UMass Amherst, Isabel Weber, wrote in 2021 in The Guardian, that kind of laid out, this basic theory that was like, there are all these kind of supply chain disruptions for why there is inflation. But, if you just look at the profit margins that companies in a lot of different sectors are bringing in, they clearly are pretty well above what just the increased cost of inputs are. That's the kind of premise of the theory. And this was, essentially impugned by a lot of economists as, a conspiracy theory, that companies would be, possibly profiteering from the inflationary conditions of, 2021 and 22. So for that, kind of theory, that school of thought to then become more or less the basis of the economic rollout for a major presidential candidate in the Democratic Party is like, for them, it's this big coup, And I think that's
they lost
part
the
of the
intellectual
freakout.
war, right?
Right.
They kind of lost the intellectual fight, right?
Right.
So let me give Dylan a little time here too, because this disagreement has been brewing, as Luke laid out, right? We've basically been litigating this dispute as the causes and the role, the culpability of firms with price-setting power, right? Neoliberals can't fathom the idea that a firm who sets prices could have anything to do with inflation. I wanted to ask you about where you think this disagreement comes from between, say, the neoliberal, I think Luke was being charitable, neoclassical, the neoliberal and progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And maybe you can give us maybe a bit of the background. What's the history here?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so in terms of the history, I think you can go back really pretty far to sort of see the inception of this. Um, for one example, there was sort of an academic Red Scare a few decades ago. MIT and Harvard pushed out a lot of their more lefty economists who then got scooped up by UMass Amherst, who looked around and said, wow, there's all these talented people who need academic econ jobs, which is kind of the intellectual legacy that made UMass Amherst arguably the foremost heterodox program in the country. Um, but fast forwarding a whole lot, I think there's basically three things that are causing this dissension between progressive wing of the party and progressive economists versus neoliberal pundits and some neoliberal economists. I think the first thing is that a lot of the neoliberal pundits and economists have a bad habit to not read what the progressive folks are actually saying. Matt Iglesias has been criticizing sellers inflation for 2 years. He openly admitted that he hadn't read Isabella Weber until uh, mid-June, I think. So, better part of 2 years, he's been arguing against what he thought she said and what he thought other people said. Um, Catherine Rampell, a Washington Post columnist, also has targeted Warren and Casey's price anti-price gouging legislation that they introduced in the Senate in July. Said that it would enable the government to set prices directly. It doesn't. It just doesn't. Um, and then just another example, and this isn't so much economics as it is just like general discourse, but back when someone erroneously reported Noam Chomsky had died and some outlets published premature obits, Noah Smith, who's another neoliberal blogger, published really a would-be grave dancing attack on Chomsky as this raging communist, which misread or didn't read most of Chomsky's work. He's very famously not a communist. He's an anarchist, which in a lot of ways is the opposite. But then the second reason I think there's disagreement here is that these folks generally like price discrimination. They view it as more efficient. Rampell, again, when she was writing her much maligned piece on, actually, it's great that Wendy's is going to have surge pricing for their, they don't have Whoppers, I don't know what they have, for their Baconators. And Iglesias on Monday this week, I don't know if this will come out this week, but recently Iglesias also defended the idea that CVS should be free to charge parents more money when they need to get their kids medicine in the middle of the night, because it leads to more price efficiency, and they sort of tacitly assume that this will be offset by some people being targeted with lower prices as well. I don't think they've got too much of a leg to stand on there. But that's what they believe. And then the final thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up for a little bit, is there is a tendency among a certain class of neoclassical economists and adherents that just simply believes that introductory macroeconomics models can explain everything that happens in the economy. And they genuinely just don't believe that they need to look anything anywhere else to be able to explain things.
Yeah, that's right. Luke looks like he's been chomping at the bit to say something. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Luke.
Yeah. I mean, just to underscore a bunch of points Dylan made, because I largely agree. I think that also just the core of this that we'll come back to throughout this conversation is that the neoclassical economists just seem to be more or less like allergic to recognizing market power and how it operates. So a lot of their theories are sort of more or less kind of theoretical, that they have charts, and when it comes to price gouging specifically, I think the hang up for them, and Zephyr Teachout laid this out pretty well in a piece she wrote in the Atlantic, is that they view price gouging as this kind of temporary imbalance between supply and demand. And some companies will raise their prices, but that will just lead to more profits, and it invites other market actors to go into that market because they're high profits. So they'll set up new shops, they'll start producing more, and that will just naturally increase the supply over time, and the market works itself out. But what that I think really kind of elides here is that, first of all, a lot of the profiteering we're talking about happens under temporary conditions. So there's a natural disaster, obviously the pandemic, or then we have the inflation period. It takes time for other competitors, rivals, to enter a new market, to meet all the kind of barriers to entry and such. Doesn't just happen overnight like that. And then also, I would say a little bit more broadly, I think what we've learned over recent decades with the kind of degree of concentration that's built up across huge swaths of the economy is that oligopolies and monopolistic actors have developed these very sophisticated ways of kneecapping rivals, competitors who are trying to encroach into their market share. Exclusive dealing, there's a lot of other tools. So it's not just as simple as it seems in charts that there'll just be some kind of wellspring of more supply if there's price gouging.
Well, isn't it like you guys remember? Y'all remember contestable market theory, right? Baumol, the quick hit entry, right? It seems like to me price gouging is the inverse of that. You can actually hold a temporary monopoly power, and there is no incentive for anyone to enter at all during that temporary time period because everybody knows it's temporary. So and there's no supply response at all. And Dylan raised the point of the surge pricing in CVS. That's exactly an excellent example of this, because it's not that it's so completely inelastic that someone is going to splurge at that CVS for that extra cough syrup or something like that. That breaks up the distinction between willingness to pay and ability to pay. And so it may very well cause people not to purchase that, and then people might die from this. There's some serious consequences to some of the surge pricing that doesn't get addressed. But Dylan, I want to ask you, is this a packaging issue for the Harris campaign? How have they responded to all these criticisms?
I think so far she's sticking with this kind of policy, which I think is good. I think even among a lot of these folks that we're talking about being misinformed and counterproductive on this issue, there's some recognition that these anti-price fixing measures are genuinely very popular. Hal and Luke mentioned this at the top. We've won the intellectual war in terms, at least in the view of the public. And I do want to quickly make one thing clear. This isn't everyone who believes in neoclassical economists, in neoclassical economics. There's definitely a range. And among some people who I would consider quite mainstream, who have actually read these policies, they are far, far less critical. Justin Wolfers, for example, who I would consider quite mainstream for an economist and generally neoclassical. Um, on, I think CNN vocally defended Harris
Saw
and
that.
this policy.
Yeah.
He was at least honest that she wasn't calling for outright price controls, as a lot of other people like Catherine Appel suggested, at least. Yeah.
And that it was limited to the grocery industry,
Groceries.
and
Yeah.
it would only kick in the event of another crisis. So it's not
Right.
like the day that the law goes into effect, we wouldn't be regulating prices, right? It would only be applicable in a very
Right.
specific industry and in a very specific contingency. I think Darren probably wanted to get one more thing in.
Yeah, I mean, no one's saying bring back the Interstate Commerce Commission, right? So we're not going to regulate the entire economy. All right. Well, maybe some people are, but that's not what Harris campaign's doing at the moment.
No, I think something that I raised in a piece for the Sling back in 2022. I think it was 2022. It was a long time ago. Back at the very start of the Sling. But a point that I raised there and that I raised a number of times is that it really is reliance on basic macro models only, not even just economics. Like this is very much a pretty typical example of price gouging, or sorry, of rent seeking, as David Ricardo wrote about it, which goes back to like some of the earliest foundational texts of modern economics.
That's right. I wanted to just talk about very quickly and selfishly, The Economist magazine put out a piece, and I clipped out a little portion of it, and the tweet did pretty well, but where they basically said that we can't even talk about price gouging without undermining, the very functioning and working of a capitalist system, right? And for me, it was illuminating. I think it was illuminating for the people who read it too. The idea that we've like stepped into some kind of sacred territory. We're not even, the discourse is kind of off limit. It seems like they're almost trying to police the boundaries of what we can and cannot debate. And I never really understood this. And maybe it was just a throwaway line, but have we gotten to the place that just capitalist and the capitalist system is so fragile that we can't even have this debate? I'll just note that you never see these guys even recognize it. The Economist just kind of dismisses the evidence, but we've got a Council of Economic Advisors study, right, that talks about how higher margins contributed somewhat to inflation. They acknowledge there are other factors, but the higher margins did. And we've got the Federal Trade Commission noting that some large grocers actually engaged in price gouging. And then finally, yesterday, during the Kroger-Albertsons merger, which I know we're going to get to, but an executive, disclosed in an email that that's exactly what they were doing. They were using a small amount of generalized inflation as a pretext for raising their prices, to some significantly higher level. I'm just curious if you guys think that, why did this really touch a nerve in this in kind of on the Twitter space? What do you think? Have we crossed into this new threshold? And I don't know, what's the future? What does the future hold for this debate?
Yeah, well, I mean, Hal is like a chronicler of, another chronicler of the Economist most wrong take. So I think you take the belt as the chief critic. I mean, I think what I took away from that line in the Economist piece is, they're criticizing the Harris platform, but they do recognize that, price gouging, combating price gouging, that is also, widely popular with voters. So it's like, voters shouldn't be allowed to sow mistrust in big, corporate behemoth institutions. It's not the fault of those corporations' practices that are undermining, trust. I mean, that seems to more or less be what they're suggesting there.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I was going to move on unless you got to our next topic, RealPage, unless Dylan or Darren are just dying to have one more whack at the price gouging thing.
I'd like to take one more whack,
Sure,
if that's
do it.
all right. Um,
Hopefully you
so
won't cause the markets to crater, but go ahead. I'm now very nervous about these snowflakes. Go ahead.
fair. So I think there's a couple of things that I want to just mention quickly. One is going back to that fact about MIT and Harvard pushing out more liberal economists, and how a former student of yours that I'm in a graduate program with actually told me that something similar happened with BYU, and Utah scooped up some more liberal folks. But I think that that has a lasting legacy that kind of, you'll notice this group of people who are extremely critical of price gouging have very similar intellectual pedigrees. So generally either an Ivy League, or if not an Ivy League, MIT, Stanford, or U Chicago. But like Catherine Rampell, Matt Iglesias, uh, Furman, Larry Summers, Megan McArdle, and Jamie Dimon all went to Ivy League schools. Noah Smith went to Stanford. So I think there is some institutional elitism tied in there as well. And this is really why Freddie P established that economic media project, is because you definitely get policing the discourse. Jason Furman commented a while back at a Cato Institute event that he was speaking at.
Go figure.
Yeah, basically saying that um, if you're not PhD economist who agrees with him, you shouldn't be able to shape policy. Matt Iglesias has several times called for bringing back the economists, by which he certainly doesn't mean you. He means Jason Furman and Larry Summers, because you don't agree with him. But yes,
And
hopefully
bring
that didn't spook the markets.
Well, some of those economists, I mean, in those traditional, neoclassical schools, they don't really necessarily teach, very strong history of thought kinds of curricula, and so they don't actually, they read all the basic theories without the warning labels. And so you can see that as you go through all the textbooks, like, and if you look through all the, Glick Lazada and I did this, where we just went through all the law and econ textbooks, and they all had different definitions of wealth maximization. And so what they think is a consistent, coherent theory is actually not. But so it becomes this kind of religion for them, where like, if you don't agree with me, then you're going to hell, or economics hell, I guess.
Well, let's switch over
Sociology.
to the sorry. Let's switch over to the second topic just to show it some love as well. That's the RealPage's price fixing complaint brought by the DOJ. And I'll note that the DOJ is a little late to the party. There's already a private enforcement case going on, brought on behalf of renters. So we've known about at least these allegations for a long time. And I'll just say in my wind up that given how important housing is to the CPI, which I think is about a third overall, and given that owned homes, the prices of owned homes in that index is tethered or imputed from rental. If the rental markets were exposed to this alleged price fixing conspiracy, that could have really been a significant driver of overall inflation, right? And yet no one was talking about it. I don't recall anyone talking. They basically discounted this as a kind of a conspiracy, a crackpot theory. And it's very possible that when we get to the damages in the RealPage case, right, we'll find out that they were at the center of the rental inflation, and rental inflation was at the center of the CPI. You guys have any reactions to that? I found that very, very discouraging over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll just point out, because this was kind of the subtext of the magazine piece that you mentioned earlier, from our pricing issue, which is voters basically for the past 3 years or so have been mainly angry about rising prices in 3 core areas. It's housing, it's groceries, as we've talked about earlier, They're really mad about gas prices as well. I'll put a fourth category of healthcare, but that's, kind of eternal, not as much in the CPI. So there have been massive price fixing scandals that regulators have discovered in each key area there. The FTC sanctioned a oil executive, Scott Sheffield of Pioneer, who had been colluding with OPEC during 2022 and 2021. Pretty massive scandal to try and lower supply in order to keep gas prices high. We'll talk about groceries later, but you can just look at earnings calls from a lot of key grocery executives talking about how inflation was great conditions for them to raise their profits, raise prices, above normal levels. And then, in housing here, we have now a huge DOJ lawsuit against RealPage, a software company that, contracts with landlords and other apartment management companies all across the country, and really, has a pretty labyrinthic scale and kind of God's eye look into, what's happening with housing supply.
Yeah. Just off the top, anyone who watches this and hasn't already should read that entire um, pricing issue from, it was June, right? That whole issue of the American Prospect is fantastic. I also want to shout out several of my colleagues who have been bird dogging RealPage specifically for nearly 2 years now. They started in October of 2022. So we've been very invested in seeing all of this develop. I generally just agree with Luke, but turning to the Fed portion of your question, I do think the Fed erred in at least 3 ways. First, it misdiagnosed the causes. They treated this like it was demand-induced inflation and worried about a wage price spiral that was just never really happening. Second, they just were over-reliant, like you mentioned, on housing, which is probably the biggest lagging indicator of them all when you're looking at CPI. And third is they clung to the 2% target much too hard, which actually constrained supply of things like housing as well as other stuff like renewable energy infrastructure even more than it already was, which only made it worse. Another thing I wrote for the Sling was that the Fed should abandon its 2% target rate, or at least reconsider it, which was kind of heretical at the time, but since then it's been endorsed by Richard Thaler, Paul Krugman, and Olivier Blanchard, whose name I probably butchered. So it's definitely gaining some traction, but I think those are the places where the Fed specifically erred.
Yeah. Let's go back to the RealPage complaint. Is there anything in the complaint? I want to get Darren back in here too. Is there anything in the complaint that may have stood out to you that you wouldn't have known unless you actually gave it a read?
Yeah, I can take this. There's some pretty incredible stuff in there. It does, in broad strokes, it's very similar to the two previous lawsuits filed by the Attorney General's office in the state of Arizona and also DC. There's a whole range of plaintiff lawsuits that have been consolidated in Tennessee, I think that is. And the DOJ, more or less mirrors the kind of, core legal argument here. Essentially what they're claiming here is that, RealPage has, pretty dramatically built up its operations over the past decade. In particular, there was a big merger in 2017 with another real estate software company that kind of, sort of consolidated its control. And what they do that sets off alarm bells for a price fixing case is they're not just, kind of consulting with apartment management companies using generally publicly available data. They actually, require their clients to hand over a bunch of privileged competitive information about their units, about their leasing terms, about prices, kind of running the whole gambit there. They then, with all their clients, they, sort of, collect this information and they run it through a software, algorithm to generate what they believe are the most optimal, prices for their clients. And RealPage is very explicit about this, and you can understand from the client side why they're popular. They say, we will increase your profits. And as a apartment management company, there's not that many ways that you do that other than, increasing prices. And that has proven to be the case. And RealPage executives have said this pretty explicitly. And RealPage clients have also, told in deposition the DOJ that, we use this service because it helps us, manage our price increases. The other key dimension of the case, which I'll get into because there's some novel stuff that we learned from the DOJ lawsuit, is that one of RealPage's innovations and tactics in housing markets is typically in a competitive market, landlords do not want to raise their prices too high, or they won't be able to fill the occupancy. They won't be able to fill those rooms. But if you're using a software price fixing cartel that has information about all the other actors in your area, they will allow those landlords to keep prices high and to wait out until they find a tenant who's willing to meet that higher price. But I will say what we learned from the DOJ, one particular part of this that I don't think had been previously known, is that RealPage has such a God's eye look into the housing supply in localized key housing markets that when they know there's going to be a huge amount of apartment units that are coming onto the market, for example, 12 months ahead when that lease is up, they will then, for other landlords, they will ensure that the 12-month lease is at a much higher price than a 13-month or 11th-month lease, so that tenants are sort of incentivized to go for those leases, and there's less supply at that 12-month mark when all those leases come out, which is just, it's just a kind of mind-boggling, degree of command and control that they have over these housing markets. That was one of my key takeaways. There's some incredible quotes that the DOJ got from landlords as well that we can get into.
Let's talk about those quotes. And I want to do the New York Times edition of this and say there's very good arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we have Stephen Weissman, who's the outside lawyer for RealPage, arguing that the information sharing is legal because the company aggregates rental data from numerous sources rather than showing specific rates at rival properties. And he also says that those quotes are cherry-picked. But one of the quotes that apparently is cherry-picked is this quote on paragraph 129: landlords understand the sensitivity of the information being shared and the likely anti-competitive effects. One potential client put it succinctly to RealPage: I always like this product because your algorithm uses proprietary data from other subscribers to suggest rents and terms. That's classic price fixing. So both are good arguments on both sides, right? Thoughts?
So I think this is a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge argument from their lawyer. Sharing publicly available information is obviously not illegal, but they're sort of just asserting that that's what it was without responding to the specific. This was taken out of context as the classic non-defense defense. Yeah, I think everything Luke said here kind of applies to this as well. Just there's so much in the complaint that quibbling about these little things is mostly, I think, show lawyering and not substantial. Yeah, we didn't actually violate the law. And then one thing I'll add is this is jumping back a little bit, but until March, I lived in an apartment that was owned by a company that used RealPage. And one of the things that I was subject to was them. They basically forced me to rent for an extra month because I gave them notice that I was leaving, and the building manager wrote down that I was leaving. But because I didn't write it down, they then said that didn't count as official notice and made me rent at a month-to-month rate that was absolutely ridiculous. It was 3,300 for a one bedroom for 1 month. Um, and I think that that ties back into the supply constraint that Luke mentioned briefly about how they'll wait for someone who will pay the higher prices sometimes and hold units off the market until they know people will be willing to sign those more expensive leases. Part of how they're doing, this is somewhat speculative, but at least in my personal experience, they were also shifting the costs of having an empty apartment off of them and onto residents moving out. So I just wanted to throw that in there. And that is alleged and speculative, and I will not assert that as any kind of legal fact. Please don't sue me.
Was that, were you living in DC in that
No,
apartment?
I live in Nashville,
Oh,
actually.
oh.
Maybe I should look into those Tennessee lawsuits some more.
Yeah, yeah, you might be entitled to some class action compensation. Yeah.
Just not enough to get keep the deposit anymore. It's
Right.
just not profitable. Um, so um, so I want to talk about Vice President Harris's build more houses, um, sort of 3 million new homes to sort of help with rental rates. And I can't help but notice that in the complaint they talk a great deal about concentration, with 5 or fewer landlords manage more than 50% of the multifamily homes in about 109 core-based statistical areas. So it doesn't matter if you build more homes, right? It has to be homes that are not owned by the current landlords in order to deconcentrate the market. Is that a piece that's kind of missing from the Harris proposal?
Well, she does have a whole, I mean, we can talk about that part of the housing proposal, but just to be clear, like she also has a whole plank where she says, Wall Street investors and also corporate landlords using algorithmic software is part of what's probably driving up prices. I mean, the DOJ lawsuit coming about a week or two right after she rolled out that economic policy platform, I think is pretty significant, because she was clearly indicating a kind of wink wink that she would be endorsing basically this kind of lawsuit as one major force that's driving up housing prices,
But
along with the other parts. Yeah.
But the other part of that is acquisitions, right? So it's one thing to say that there's maybe new entry in the rental market, but you have to be on the other side and stop future acquisitions that would increasingly concentrate the market. So you're back to square one.
Darren, that's fairly tame, though. I mean, why not go so far as deconcentrating? Why not put caps on the share of units that a single entity can hold in a given neighborhood? That's something I've been kind of screaming for a bit. I don't think Harris has gone that communist yet, has she?
No, I mean, but I think you're right. I just didn't think that. I didn't even think that was. I've been screaming for a long time about stronger merger controls, and mostly on deaf ears. So thanks. I've never been called a conservative before, so this is great.
Well, in the remaining time we have, why don't we shift gears very quickly to the Kroger Albertsons merger? And I guess I've got one for Luke and one for Dill. My Luke question is, how does this trial, which just kind of kicked off, relate to Harris's new focus on rising grocery costs, if at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting backdrop, I think, for this case to be playing out in the final months of this presidential election. So, and again, just to reiterate here, Harris's economic platform also includes a line where she says that consolidation in the food and grocery industry is another factor for why there are much higher prices at grocery stores as well. So, the biggest grocery merger to consolidate the market right now is this $24 billion Kroger purchase of Albertsons. And that court case just started this week. If Kroger and Albertson, and this was filed in 2022, I should say, if the merger goes through, Kroger Albertsons as a combined firm would control what's estimated to be about 60% of grocery sales. I mean, they would be easily the largest, grocery behemoth in the U.S. And what we've, I think, learned already in the court case, actually on day one from Kroger's executives, ties totally back to this conversation we were having earlier about the inconceivability that there was price gouging going on in the food grocery industry. A Kroger executive is on the stand and is being asked about their pricing strategies, and essentially says, when we have one of our stores in a local area where there's maybe one other competitor or so, we do this thing called a probe, where we raise our prices, and if we don't lose a ton of sales, our competitor might match that price because they want in on it. And in areas where there isn't really another major grocery competitor, we can essentially raise our prices above even what the regular inflation numbers would be. So that's already a pretty huge validation. There are other aspects of the case, but part of the core of this is that the merger shouldn't go through because it's going to raise prices on consumers.
Yeah, and let me give Dylan the last word here because we're running short on time on Kroger Albertsons. I've got my favorite angle, which is I feel like the going after labor harms or harm to workers, particularly unionized workers, is a neat angle. But I don't want to hog the mic. If there's another aspect of the case that you find more exciting, feel free to go after that instead.
I'll kind of split the difference. My favorite thing that's come out of the trial this week is that Kroger, I forget if this was testimony or if it was written evidence, but Kroger explicitly said, we don't use pricing strategies to compete with Costco or Walmart. We use pricing strategies to compete with Albertsons. So they're like, when we need to lower prices to be competitive, it's because we're competing with Albertsons. And I just think that like, really that feels to me like hook, line, and sinker. Like you took the bait there.
It gives away the game because that's been their main defense. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. On the labor thing, I totally agree. I think it's something that is well within federal law to use as a basis to reject the merger. We've had kind of a myopic focus on consumer welfare and absolutely minimizing near to medium term consumer prices for decades. And it's good to see people actually going back and reading what the law says, because the Sherman Act does not in any way specify that the harms have to be in the form of prices. I don't want to say too much here, Hal, because you are definitely more of an expert than I am, but it seems like a good legal strategy. It seems to be supported by federal law and case law. I hope it sticks.
Well, because you said the word consumer welfare, I know that Darren's ears probably perked up, and I'm going to let him close us out. That's okay.
Well, that's way too much time. We're almost out of time, so I won't go into that discussion. But talk about economists not reading the caveats. In Bork and Pagoo and in Marshall. I'll close with one quick thing. You mentioned UMass Amherst and Utah as two havens where people who were economists who kind of were fleeing the Red Scare ended up, and the other was UC Riverside, and also of course New School would be the four places I'd go for heterodox economics if I just wanted to read.
Well, thanks for the plug, Darren. I appreciate that. And I want to thank Luke and Dylan for coming onto the show. Hope you had as much fun as I did. And I haven't checked the stock market lately, but with luck, we haven't managed to wreck everyone's Labor Day weekend. Have a good one. Thanks for coming on the show, and I'll catch you on the next Slingshot.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.